Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Maria Rundus, the production manager here at CFN, and I'm glad to be joined by Timothy Flanders. Tim is the editor of OnePeterFive. He's the founder of Meaning of Catholic and the author of many books, most recently the When Gates of Hell Prevail, what Catholics Do in Dark Times. I'm sure most of our audience is going to know who Tim is. He's a kind of a staple in the traditional Catholic landscape, and so we're pleased to be joined by him. Welcome on CFN, Tim.
Hey, thanks a lot, brother. Thank you for your good work. I'm a subscriber of CFN, and I enjoy your weekly broadcast, so thanks for doing that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, it's for our audience that might not know a whole lot about your background. You've talked about this before on other shows, but perhaps you could give our audience a little bit of your story. Of course, you were raised ELCA Lutheran, I believe, mainline Lutheran, and you kind of had many twists and turns to get where you're at now, but maybe you could give our audience a little bit of a rundown.
Sure. I was blessed with very pious Protestant parents, and I was raised in the biggest Lutheran denomination, the ELCA, which is relatively higher liturgically relative to a lot of Protestant sects. But in high school, I became a Baptist. In college, I'm very enamored with Messianic Judaism because I was searching for this original faith. And then eventually I became convinced by Eastern Orthodox apologetics, and I became Eastern Orthodox. So I was confirmed in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Antiochians, back in 2010. I spent 3 years as a communicant until shortly after Pope Francis was elected. I came into communion with Rome in May of 2013. So I've never been a Catholic other than under Pope Francis, but that's the long story cut short.
Quite a time to be a Catholic for sure. It's when it comes to being a convert, there's a lot of steps that all of us have to take on our way to coming to the fullness of the true faith. Is there any one of those periods of your life that in another religion that you think you gained the most virtue from? Which one of those religions would you say you grew the most and it helped you prepare you to be a good Catholic today?
Wow, it's an interesting question. I think it was among the Eastern Orthodox because I went to confession. I had a valid confession.
Mhm.
So there was some sort of graces going on there. And it was experiencing the priesthood in the among Eastern Orthodox that I think really it sort of opened my eyes to Catholicism because it's ultimately accepting the universal spiritual fatherhood of the papacy. So experiencing the spiritual fatherhood of a priest opened me to allowing that universal fatherhood.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a lot of similarities with them, and it's something I think is very important is converts are often come in and they really just don't know where to begin. And I think your book, your latest book, the When Gates of Hell Prevail, is a good place. I wish I would have had it when I converted into Catholicism. Something I wanted to ask you though, while you've had all of these different twists and turns, there's a passage in your book that says, let a man examine himself and see whether his peace is disturbed by reading the news or investigating controversy. If he is disturbed, let him drop everything and come back to the Lord, fighting strenuously against the temptations towards effeminacy and embracing the cross. And I think that's definitely true, especially for Catholics today. Sometimes we have to just drop everything. But what would you say to people who might say, well, you're a convert, you've certainly had to investigate controversy in these other traditions in order to come to Catholicism? How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I guess I mean, I'm not sure if this is going to answer the question exactly, but I certainly feel a lot of peace even under Pope Francis because I've tried all the alternative, or not all, but I mean I've tried a lot of the alternatives. I think Eastern Orthodoxy is kind of like the next best thing, if you will. It's sort of the most
Mhm.
tempting option for many Catholics, I think. And I've tried that and it still doesn't work. And so there's a great piece for me uh having Catholicism, which is basically, I mean, for traditional Catholics such as us, we would have, obviously we have grievances against the current magisterium, but we hope for some future magisterial act to put things right again. And that's not a pipe dream, because we know that that's happened in the past and it will happen in the future, because our church actually has the power, the authority to actually rectify doctrinal confusion. Whereas among the Eastern Orthodox, there's really just no apparatus to do that. And so there's not really that peace. We can't really rest assured that it'll be, the Eastern Orthodox will call an ecumenical council, because they haven't done that for over a millennium. Whereas we know that the papacy, even though it's sort of in a period of darkness, that the church will prevail because it's prevailed before and it has the power to do that. So I certainly have peace among being a Catholic. So no matter what the news says, I know that the church can and will prevail.
When it comes to searching for this peace, do you identify that more with an intellectual piece of saying everything has internal consistency? Or do you identify that more with emotional peace, not being riled up in the will?
That's a great question. And I think that would probably depend on one's own temperament, first of all, because I think some
Mhm.
are much more in tune with their emotional life, others are hyper intellectual. I think for me, it's kind of a mix depending on what topic there is. Um, there certainly needs to be enough intellectual cohesion so that things make sense. That's the source of a lot of the crisis today, because there's not an intellectual cohesion with what's going on. Um, I think that the foundation does need to be an intellectual truth, because that has to be the guidance for the settling of one's emotions. But in meditating on the truth, one's own spiritual joy can be in one's heart. So there's sort of a divine element to the affective meditation of the truth. So I think it's I think it can be sort of emphasized more for different persons, but um, I guess for me it's an affective joy. I would land there.
We're gonna talk more about the big tent. I think that's fair to call it what that is, meaning of Catholic, and 1 Peter 5, and sort of to get closer to the original question. When do you think that there is a point in which you have a position and you sort of stop investigating other positions? Do you see it as that being a prudent course to take, to say, I have my position, I've established peace in this sort of position, and I'm going to stop investigating others?
Oh yeah. I mean, we've investigated things as I mean, first of all, there's the faith, there's the Catholic
Mhm.
faith. So I'm not investigating any other faiths at this point. I haven't for 10 years plus. Um, there's no reason for me to try anything else. But in terms of contemporary questions, I think there's a lesser hold on one's own identity, in the sense that how new are these controversies? Are they 500 years old? Are we talking about the De Auxiliis controversy that's 300 years old or whatever? Are we talking about the Vatican I controversy over 100 years old? Are we talking about the Vatican II controversy, which is the newest of all those? And I think that the one's own definitive character towards a school of thought, the definitive character decreases with the recent character of the thing, because the further we are from an event, the more certain I think we can be about everything. But I do think that a certain point, you do latch on to a certain school of thought, um, because that's the one that makes sense. But it's a complex mess of Catholic chaos.
Mhm. Indeed. Before we get into more of the specifics of the position of meaning of Catholic and 1 Peter 5, what was your reason for starting meaning of Catholic? What was the impetus behind that? What did you want to see meaning of Catholic establish, and what did you want to see it accomplish?
Meaning of Catholic was meant to it is meant to unite Catholics against the enemies of Holy Church. And what I saw was after 2018 with McCarrick, there were Catholics who were questioning their faith or having a hard time. And I was trying to say, well, with Meaning of Catholic, there's no reason to think that the grass is greener on the other side of Catholicism into Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever. And there's all these most of the controversy can be resolved by the basic dogmatic texts that we already have in the Catholic Church. And these things. So it was about providing resources to people that Catholics might not be aware of, and which helps unite us towards keeping the faith against the world, the flesh, and the devil. But I also knew that coming into Catholicism myself, I had to overcome my own prejudices against Catholicism. And I think that Catholics, in order to truly do truth and charity, they have to overcome the prejudices that they have towards other fellow Catholics. And like I'm involved with Mass of the Ages. Mass of the Ages is about helping sort of non-trads overcome the prejudices that they might have towards trads by just presenting, here's traditional Catholicism, here's the Latin Mass. Trad Catholics are just ordinary Catholics, as all our forefathers were. So Meaning of Catholic is about pursuing the truth with fellow Catholics.
2018 was really such a different landscape when it comes to the traditional Catholic world. Things were a lot different. Of course, it's before COVID. The traditional Latin Mass didn't see really the explosion. You had the initial explosion of Summorum Pontificum that already happened, but things have certainly changed. Do you think when it comes to traditional Catholic content creation in the media world, do you think the landscape, if you will, has become better or worse? How do you think it's changed for the better or the worse?
I think it's definitely been better, in my opinion. First of all, COVID brought about a lot of growth in traditional Catholicism, as far as I know, and it was because of media to some degree. I know there's an article by Matthew Pleasy on this where he goes into some statistics on this, and I can't quote him, but you have all this exposure to the Latin Mass through YouTube because there's all these streaming services. People aren't going to Mass. COVID is shutting down people. And then you have all these traditional parishes that are staying open a lot more often than others. And so you have a lot of people coming to the traditional parishes. And then Mass of the Ages, I think, is a huge aspect to that as well. I mean, if memory serves, I feel like it was post 2018 that the CFN weekly news show started too. Because
I believe so. I believe a little bit after.
I feel like it was I feel like it was Matt Gaspers and Brian McCall set it up like in 2022 or something like that. Something in the past few years. And there's also been the downfall of Church Militant happened, which is not really quite trad either. Obviously we have issues with the Church Militant. But in terms of like media content, they had media media that was quality media in terms of qua media, not necessarily in terms of content. So, I mean, I would say it's improved. There's an increase of traditional Catholic spaces in media.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's challenges that comes with that. I mean, just as things scale, you get more drama. I think there's more temptations associated with content creation nowadays. But I think in general, I would agree with you. It's it seems to be a better space. There's just simply more content that's accessible. Now, of course, after you established Meaning of Catholic, later on you became the editor of OnePeterFive. Do you see the two missions as being substantially different? Do you think, because when I was reading the The editorial position of 1 Peter 5 and the Confession of Faith that Meaning of Catholic has, there's slight differences, but they look substantially the same. Do you see it the same way?
Well, Meaning of Catholic is not traditionalist. It's not trying to be traditionalist as by trads for trads. It
Mhm.
is trying to um, have a true form of dialogue between trads and non-trads and Meaning of Catholic. Now, the Confession of Faith is obviously very traditional. No one who's a modernist is allowed on Meaning of Catholic. But if you are, there are people who come on Meaning of Catholic who would not say they are a trad, would not
Mhm.
identify as a trad, might not go to the Latin Mass or whatever. They may even critique the trads. But as long as they have that confession of faith, that is enough. Whereas the 1 Peter 5 is by trads for trads. It's meant to be. This is the traditional. This is we're trying to we're trying. 1 Peter 5 is trying to contribute to the traditional movement. Our place within the traditional movement. For example, we're promoting the Crusade of Eucharistic Reparation as our part within the overall traditional movement, and we're trying to also unite the clans among the traditionalists. And so, no one is published at 1 Peter 5 who is not a trad, self-identified as a trad. There are some exceptions I've made to that here and there, but most of all, this is written by trads. And we'll have inter-trad debates at 1 Peter 5, but we're not going to have a trad and sort of a non-trad communio type guy at 1 Peter 5. So I think there's definitely overlap between the two. Obviously, I run both organizations, so there is an overlap. But there is, and there's some similarities in goals, but one is meant to be totally trad, and the other one is not.
So when it comes to establishing what exactly traditionalism is and what is a traditional Catholic, and we'll break down. I want to break down with you later about the three things that you see as essential, as fundamental things that you can't reject. That being Second Vatican Council is an ecumenical council. The new mass is a valid mass, and Pope Francis is the Pope. Aside from those things, though, which I think Meaning of Catholic and 1 Peter 5 both share as a part of their agenda, if you to use a sort of loaded term there, uh, what do you think is the specific difference that makes a traditional Catholic? What's the difference between a traditional Catholic and say a conservative Catholic in your eyes?
In my opinion, the cultist defines the movement, and the traditional Catholic promotes the traditional Latin Mass in opposition to the Novus Ordo in some sense of that word, not necessarily denying the Novus Ordo, as I said, but in opposition to the whole program of the reform of the Mass, um, asserting that the Latin Mass must be preserved, as well as all the traditional devotions. So the whole liturgical and devotional life that was already present in 1960 is preserved in the traditional movement. I think that is the core right there. I think all the other issues flow from that. Um, so to me, that's the core of being a traditional Catholic.
And in that statement that you just made, there could of course be different interpretations as to what that means, right? Whether it's an essential part of the church, these traditional the traditional liturgy, the traditional practices, whether or not you can celebrate the new mass, etc. Do you think that there is a danger to having a big tent movement like this, where there are a myriad of different interpretations as to what that statement that you just said means? And do you think that there's any other movements in the past that accomplished um, such a big tent movement in order to bring about the betterment for Holy Mother Church?
Well, there is a danger anytime you try to unify Catholics for a common goal, because the danger is that the other matters could be dismissed, but they're still important. Those things are also important. The liturgy must inform the doctrine, the doctrinal questions, the spiritual questions. There must be a cohesion between those two things. The liturgy is the 1962 missal, or the 55 missal, is simple in a sense because it's just a bunch of red and black that you pray. So that's unifying in the sense that we can just all get together and pray that liturgy. But the danger is that we should not minimize all the other issues. I think, in my opinion, as the editor of OnePeterFive, the proper application of Unite the Clans is to say, let's go pray the mass together. And that's the basis for actually facing all these other issues. So we can actually face them and not negate them and not minimize them, because truth is not, we should not be indifferent to the truth. So I think that's the danger. We shouldn't minimize all these other issues, but I think we should put them in their proper order. First, we have to pray the mass, then we can face all that stuff.
What would you say to somebody who might say who might flip that and say, actually, the danger is to the faith and the things introduced by in the post-conciliar world, that's the main threat, and that has to be the united factor, and the mass has to come after that. The mass is important, but it's not substantially about the mass, it's about the threat to the faith.
I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, the faith is central. We cannot, these things are concurrent realities and concurrent necessities, because we can't really pray the liturgy unless we have the faith. I think I would ask, what are the essential elements of the faith which prevent the liturgy from being celebrated? Because if the faith is first necessary, then to have the liturgy, it would seem to me that there are certainly essentials of the faith which precede the liturgy. One cannot celebrate and participate in the liturgy unless one has various essentials of the faith. But then there are various non-essentials of the faith, or disputed questions of the faith. And some of these involve post-conciliar questions. Some do not. So I think there's an overlap between some essentials of the faith that need to be established. Like one of the most recent statements against Pope Francis was regarding the Council of Trent and communion. You have to have a presupposition of the Council of Trent regarding the real presence and what communion is and state of grace is, in order to even celebrate the liturgy itself. So that would be an essential to the faith. That would be an example of that. But as far as intertrad questions, I don't think those are, like, for example, the biggest debate that we published at OnePeterFive was the debate about the papacy, debate about Vatican I ultramontanism. I think that is a question that's more stemming from the liturgy. We celebrate the liturgy. We have the essentials of the faith. We celebrate the liturgy, and that's the basis for disputing on those questions.
To sort of delve into those post-conciliar questions, I mentioned before about those three propositions that OnePeterFive and Meaning of Catholic both hold as a central part of the movement. And that was, we accept Pope Francis as the reigning pontiff, Vatican II is the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Church, and the new Mass and sacraments are valid. And later in one of these statements on Meaning of Catholic, it said these three assertions above are doubtful matters in the sense taken above. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't have a moral certitude, but if, for example, it's not a de fide proposition. But when it comes to those three propositions, do you consider why just those? Why do you consider those three an essential part of this movement, and why in particular those three points?
I think it's because of there are certain aspects of traditional Catholicism where there are Catholics promoting the Latin Mass, promoting traditional faith, but I think that they have accepted at least a de facto sedi privationism, where the they've separated themselves from the magisterium to the degree that they cannot accept one of those three things, which is presupposing that the magisterium no longer exists. Because if the magisterium no longer exists, then it cannot have a council, it cannot promulgate a valid mass, and it can't have a valid pope. And at that point, there's no, I think that that central concept, the central aspect of having a magisterium to resolve the questions, as I mentioned before previously regarding Eastern Orthodoxy, then we can't actually work to bring about this restoration of tradition, because it has to come through the magisterium. So we are resisting the magisterium, recognizing and resisting this magisterium, asking the magisterium to do certain things. We can't do any of those things if the presupposition is that there's some form of sede privationism, which would result in those three no longer being the case. So I think that there needs to be, we have a pope, we're trying to pray for this pope, we're trying to hope in future pope, we're talking to our bishop to try to resolve this. We have to resolve it through the magisterium as it exists. So I think that that's the reason for those three. I wouldn't say they're kind of like essential to the movement in a sense. They're kind of like the boundaries of traditionalism as understood, traditionalism with the magisterium.
Do you think that necessarily follows, considering somebody, for example, could say, like Canon Hesse comes to mind, saying that Vatican II was not a valid ecumenical council because they did not have the correct intent. Now, of course, that's a fringe opinion, but I would you say somebody like that should be sort of alienated from the traditionalist movement, that sort of position? And secondly, another thing that comes to mind is somebody like um, a Benevicantist, right, who says that Pope Francis did not accept is not able to become pope because he wasn't validly elected, because Benedict never resigned the papacy. Uh, do you think that those things have to be excluded from the movement um, in general?
Well, first of all, I think Catholics who become sedes of some form or another are fellow Catholics, and we should treat them as fellow Catholics. Obviously, um, they're just doing the same as we're doing. They're trying to figure out this crazy mixed up situation that we have. So I think that we should treat them like fellow Catholics. But in my view, um, I do think that they have entered into sort of a dead end, that really it can't really be resolved because there's no future. It doesn't, at least, some have theories of restoring the papacy this way or that way. But how do you move forward then? The question is, I mean, we have a game plan over here with Recognize and Resist. We have a game plan. We're, trying to get the local bishop or the new pope, as I said. But with them, what's their game plan? If you don't have, what's the future? Where are we going? I think that there's, like, Father Hess, obviously, he's making important points, because the Vatican II Council is very different, obviously, than all the other councils. So there's important points, important objections to raise about Vatican II. But if we think that, go the point where it's an invalid council, no longer it's a robber council, it does not appear to give us that future. It appears rather to create a dead end.
Just to sort of zero in on that point. So you see it, if Vatican II, why would you see something like, if Vatican II wasn't a valid council, but let's say the church in itself stayed as a stayed intact? For example, the new rite of consecration of bishops stayed intact and valid. The line of succession of popes stayed intact, but Vatican II was not a valid ecumenical council. How do you see that as creating a possible dead end?
Well, it doesn't seem to be cohesive in the way that we mentioned before, because you would say that the Pope Paul VI was a valid Pope, and he said that that council was a valid ecumenical council. So he's a valid Pope promulgating a council, calling it valid. What is the basis for not accepting that promulgation? Should we go into kind of this form and matter as Hesse goes into? I think that's a little bit shakier to assert, because ecumenical councils are quite diverse. They're not as fixed as the sacraments have form, matter, and intention. I think that's a more difficult ground than saying this is a valid Pope and promulgating this. So I think if you have a valid Pope, then his valid acts have to be valid. But we have to go into a bunch of distinctions here, because obviously we are recognize and resist. So we're saying that some things that have been promulgated are wrong in some way. But I think that it's like the validity of the Novus Ordo, because if the Novus Ordo is not valid, then 1 billion Catholics are deprived of a sacramental grace. It's, I think, a similar question to that, because if that council is not valid, then 1 billion Catholics are stripped of a valid act of the church that is alive, that has a magisterial authority. And I think it's close to that reality of losing sacramental grace in some sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would definitely agree that the form and matter applied to the council is definitely more shaky ground than the recognize and resist position. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the SSPX in relation to 1 Peter 5 and meaning of Catholic. This is mentioned in the 1 Peter 5 statement, but perhaps for our audience, you can mention it here. Do you see the SSPX in its positions as being able to fit in within the 1 Peter 5 and meaning of Catholic is trying to establish, if you will? Do you think that the SSPX deserves a seat at the table, if we can put it that way?
Yes, I do.
Yes. I think that should be clear, because of course, Kennedy Hall is over there at meaning of Catholic, and of course has been on 1 Peter 5 as well. But did want to make that clear. It's strange to me how the SSPX has gotten it's much more at the forefront now than it used to be, as you mentioned back in 2018. I think that's been a good development. To kind of shift the conversation a little bit, I wanted to ask you about an author that you've promoted in the past. I've got his book back there, Trojan Horse
Yeah, I
and the City
noticed.
of God. And my favorite as well is The Nature of Love that he published. You mentioned, as part of meaning of Catholic on the website there, that there's a problem with traditionalists identifying Thomism with Catholicism. Do you think that Dietrich von Hildebrand, that trads should look to Dietrich von Hildebrand as somebody to look to when it comes to some of his positions, his more philosophical positions? Do you see that as being an avenue that traditionalists should look to?
That's a really great question. Thanks for bringing up Hildebrand, and thank you for reading The Nature of Love, which is, I'm not even through that. It's a difficult text, long one. I mean, the reason I'm a disciple of Hildebrand is that reading his writings helps me pray. As far as his philosophical positions, I think those are less important. I think they're more like for professional philosophers to debate various philosophical nuances, which a lot of these don't bear upon the traditional movement, I think, directly. I think his philosophy of value does bear on the traditional movement, because I think that in this case, it actually gives us a better apologetic for the Latin Mass, because I should say, some Thomistic renderings of the liturgical question, not all, but some Thomistic Thomism tends to reduce things to its principal parts. And this is important. We should do this, because we're trying, like the sacramental validity, we got to reduce everything to form and matter and intention to understand the validity and have a valid sacrament. But if we do that to the whole liturgy, the liturgy becomes reduced to this thing. And that is the premise for the whole Novus Ordo right there. Whereas Hildebrand comes at it from he comes at it from a more Platonic look at the same thing, which is, how do we respond to the infinite value of Almighty God? Well, there is no limit to how we should respond. We should just maximize the response. And that's why the liturgy should be maximized to respond to the value of Almighty God, to worship him. And so that's why at the end of his book, Liturgy and Personality, actually written by his widow, Alice von Hildebrand, says the better liturgy is the liturgy which gives greater glory to God. And so that is the value of the liturgy, is in worshiping God, and the secondary purpose is in the sanctification of man. And so I think that among other aspects of Hildebrand helps the traditional movement. That's the reason that he found the Novus Ordo so problematic, was that it was not approaching it from this value standpoint, and that's tied directly to his philosophy.
Do you think that this is something I've wrestled with myself? Do you think there's a danger in Hildebrand moving away from scholasticism? Which I definitely, there's been argument about that, but I think I see Hildebrand as sort of reconciling, or at least attempting to reconcile, as you mentioned, Platonism, but also this German form of philosophical writings. I see Goethe and even some of Nietzsche's style in Hildebrand that might just be the German coming through, and reconciling that with Catholicism. Do you think there's a danger in moving away from scholasticism? And do you still see Thomism as being something central to traditionalism, for example?
Yes, I think that Thomism is central to traditionalism. I think that one of the godfathers of traditionalism is Father Reginald Carrick-Lagrange, who critiqued points of the Nouvelle Theologie as being some form of neo-modernism, 20 years before that really became apparent. And so I think Thomism should be and should continue to be the standard, and scholasticism in general should be the standard for, if you want to present a philosophical understanding, you have to be able to do it in a way that's at the same level as the whole scholastic tradition. I do think that Hildebrand, so I think there's a danger. It's definitely a danger, because that's the same danger that the Nouvelle Theologie was bringing out, that is mentioned in Humani Generis of Pius XII. He says they want to jettison these scholastic terms. We should not jettison the scholastic terms. That's very dangerous. And I think Hildebrand encountered very few good Thomists, as far as I can read his life. At the time in Germany, there was not a lot of good Thomists in Germany. And he seemed to encounter these Thomists who were sort of hyper Thomists, to say, if you're not a Thomist, you're not a Catholic sort of attitude, and which really put him off, obviously. And he mentions this in various moments in passing. I've never seen an actual a sort of a systematic critique of Thomism or of scholasticism or anything like that. It's much more applying an Augustinian Platonic phenomenology to the Catholic tradition in an attempt to be faithful to that tradition. So I think there is a danger, and I think that Hildebrand is a product of his time, in a sense that he doesn't really interact with really good Thomism. But I think, to his credit, he never really tries to present any sort of revolutionary framework as some of the Nouvelle thinkers did, where they wanted to just overthrow Baroque scholasticism. So I think there's a danger, but it needs to be, if Thomism continues to be the standard, then we can interact with other schools of thought which present other aspects of these complicated mystical questions that may help the traditional movement. But I think, yes, Thomism needs to be the standard, still central to the Thomist or the traditional movement.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Back in Hildebrand's time, I think Thomism was sort of a wilderness. It was very hit or miss. So, yeah, I think that's right on. What do you think is the biggest struggle facing traditionalism from within? What do you think when it comes to the movement dealing with itself, internal problems? What do you see the biggest problem being?
That is a great question. And I mean, I think I think traditionalists. There, I mean, Father Ripperger has this like 10 problems with traditionalism that he
Yeah,
put out like
yeah.
10 years ago or something like that, and he numbers a number of different number of different problems which I think are common to other Catholics as well, like impurity, for example. Um, but I think that traditionalists, I think, can have this de facto sedi privationism, as I mentioned, that can come into play, where I think it's a difficult thing to resist an authority, but also love that authority as well, and not provoke other fellow Catholics to hate that authority. Like the Pope is the father of our family, and we think that he's a bad father, but we want to still love him, and that's a difficult thing to do, I think, because a lot of us are uh, wounded by a spiritual fatherhood, an abusive spiritual fatherhood by the Pope or bishops or priests, and that can wound us. It can make us bitter, and so I think that that can be an issue. I think that as we mentioned before, I think the internet has become a great help to the traditional movement. But I think at the same token, it's like one of our greatest strengths and can be our greatest weakness, because the internet just sort of feeds these temptations towards backbiting and mortal sins of lack of charity, lack of piety for the hierarchy. So, I mean, I struggle with this myself, like trying to write an article at OnePeterFive about what's the latest thing that Pope Francis did. How do I say this in a way that's both charitable but also truthful, not wanting to take away any of the truth and reality of what's going on. So I think it's difficult in the tradition movement to be in that place. But the good news is, I mean, we have the tradition, which is the tradition is here to give us true humility. When we can practice the tradition, pray the tradition, that's the answer. So I think those are some of the weaknesses and difficulties inside the
Mhm.
movement.
To maybe get to a more specific part of these sorts of weaknesses, my observation is that and there's great chapters in your latest book on this regarding evangelization and almsgiving, giving to the poor. And I find, just through my observation, young men are very enthusiastic about these things and they accept the importance of them, but they simply don't know how to go and do these things because for maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I find that traditionalist communities are oftentimes they don't, as a whole, as communities, have outlets for almsgiving or evangelization, going out and being apostolic work, if you will. And I think a lot of that reason is either the priests are overworked and you've got a strenuous situation there, or you've got the communities being strangled with traditionis custodes, for example. What do you think practically is a way for young men in particular to engage in these kinds of missions as being evangelists or giving to the poor, embracing this great enthusiasm that every generation of young men should have? What are some practical ways that they can express that enthusiasm?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's what, especially what we've been trying to publish at One Peer Five, is practical stuff. Let's do this thing. Obviously, first and foremost, you need to have your spiritual life in order, your prayer life in order, before you can engage in any action. Because if you do it in reverse, then your action is going to be bitter, rancorous, or whatever, and actually provoke the opposite. So, I mentioned one of the things I wrote at OnePeterFive was how to create a trad men's conference. And this is shout out to Kennedy Hall and his Canadian brethren. I've been to the conference twice that they have. And now we're going to do our own conference where I'm at, because I think that we need to gather as men. We need to have a conference, have a retreat where we can get together and build the brotherhood up for war, so that we can go to war, but we can't go to war unless we have that true brotherhood. So I think practical steps. We've got the month of June coming up. This is what we've been promoting at OnePeterFive is practical steps. So I have an article, and that's in the book, 10 steps to restore June to the Sacred Heart. I think young men in particular doing processions is a great thing. It's a great, why not organize a procession led by lay leaders. You don't need a permission from a priest to go on a walking pilgrimage for the Sacred Heart, praying the rosary through your city, from the cathedral to your parish to wherever. That's a great way to practice the liturgy of the streets for the month of the Sacred Heart, June. Flying the Sacred Heart flag. Along with building that fraternity, forming lay sodalities. If you don't already have a lay sodality at your parish that's dedicated to almsgiving or evangelization or one of these causes for June, you can form a lay sodality. This is something that lay people have been doing for centuries to organize together so that we can pray together and work together. So there's lots of there's practical stuff in the book. There's practical stuff at OnePeterFive. We just published how to create your Eucharistic prayer reparation event a couple days ago. So there's lots of practical stuff to do. And we need the young men to get on with it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, and those things you mentioned are so important. Those are practical steps you can take. One of my favorite books is The Soul of the Apostolate, and I find that often young men have the soul, or at least are working on it, but there is no apostolate to contribute to, because because of practical being sort of timid, being shy, antisocial, or there's simply nothing to do. So these practical steps are very important. Tim, before we sign off, I'd like to get your advice for the audience. If somebody was wanting to read your books for the first time, if you could tell them which books would you read in order? Because I think, especially for converts, people new to traditional Catholicism, these are great ways that you can get an introduction to what being a traditional Catholic is all about. So what order would you read your books in?
Well, it depends on the person, I think, but the latest book is called When the Gates of Hell Prevail, What Catholics Do in Dark Times. And that's the most practical book of the 3 books that I've published, because it's just how to do this, 5 steps to do this, overcome effeminacy and be a man, 5 things, or overcome pornography, 5 things, etc. Just all these things to do. So it gives you a lot of stuff. And that was collected from writings that I had been writing from back in 2019. And these are just stuff that I learned coming into Catholicism over the years. And then I wanted to try to share with others when this whole thing started going down, like we talked about. So I think When the Gates of Hell Prevail is probably my favorite book that I've ever written. And I think it's the most practical. So, however, maybe you're a Protestant who loves the Bible. Maybe the first book is for you, the Introduction to the Holy Bible for Traditional Catholics. That is part of my own apologetic, sort of indirectly autobiographical, in the sense that this is me presenting all the ways that the Holy Scripture should be changing you, should be changing me, and I had misunderstood it for so many years. So that's definitely a book for people who love the Holy Scripture. But then the third book that I'll mention, which is the largest book, is called City of God versus City of Man. And that is the book that I think deals more with the Eastern Orthodox question but it is the overall history that convinced me to be Catholic and stay Catholic. And so I think if somebody is more into history, enjoying, also the book tries to present my hypothesis based on the providential workings of God in history, trying to make the Almighty God the protagonist of history, so that God is the one working everything in history, including up to the present. So that's my final word. If somebody likes history more, so thanks for allowing me to promote my books.
Absolutely, and they're all really solid works, especially if you're new to traditional Catholicism. So, thanks again for coming on, Tim. And we'll have links to all of your books there and OnePeterFive and Meaning of Catholic here in the description. If you want to see for our audience, if you want to see more interviews like this, you can check out our YouTube channel page or our Rumble page. We have lots of stuff like this. And if you want more reading material, you can go and check out our monthly newspaper. We'll have a link to that in the description as well. So, Tim, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, brother. God bless.
God bless.